And now, a story from the Appleseed.
Well, look at this. We get to hang out in a living room atmosphere and just enjoy some stories. It's just like home, right? Except we're surrounded by lots of cameras. So that's the only thing. But
Like Bill's house.
like Bill's house, exactly. So I'm just going to go into it. I just want to say I'm really grateful that you're here because there's a lot of things I know you could be doing tonight. So I'm really grateful for that. When I was growing up, my dad said, and listen, I know this is a stretch of the imagination, but he said I was so skinny, if I turned sideways and stuck out my tongue, I looked like a zipper. I mean, I was a really skinny little kid, knobby-kneed, pale white, freckles, big buck teeth, and red hair. As I've aged, it's naturally turned blonde. That was a joke. But I was a little tomboy. My mom called me Dennis, as in Dennis the Menace. And I did not like wearing dresses. I didn't like baby dolls. I think when I was younger, I thought baby dolls were weird. I mean, and say plastic baby. Yeah, is that strange? That's strange. How was I the only child that knew that was an odd thing, a plastic baby? And but my mom lived in a state of denial. My mom constantly tried to bend me into being a proper young lady. On Saturday nights, she would take me into the bathroom and give me my bath and then stand me in front of the sink. And she would prepare me because the next day was church. And she would brush out my long red hair and put the stopper in the sink down and fill it with bobby pins. And she would take and wrap my long red hair around her finger. You remember? Mm-hmm. And she would take it up until it was tight against my head, and she'd put 2 bobby pins crisscross and do that all the way around my head until there was 185 bobby pins pressing into my skull, right? And then I would go to bed and try and sleep on that. It's like a bed of nails. And Sunday morning I'd get up and she would go, "Oh, Kimmy, come to the bathroom and let me see." Every week. It's like she never got tired thinking that something magical was going to happen and that things would go differently. And I would stand in front of the sink and look in the mirror, and half of them would be hanging out already from moving around. And she'd pull them out, drop them in the sink, and a red curl would fall. And then she'd pull them out, and a red curl would fall, and she'd drop them in the sink until she was done, and I'd have red curls all over my head. And then she would take her fingers and gently run through those curls to separate them and make it full. And then she'd pull back the top, put in a rubber band and a yarn bow, a bow made of thick yarn, puffy thick yarn. And then she'd say, "Oh, let's get you dressed for church." Now, when I was growing up, which is just the early 70s, it seems a long time ago, my grandson recently said, "Nana, did you really live in the 1970s? I mean, I was like, yes, and I rode a mule to school. But we had 3 things in our closet. We had good clothing. That was for church and special occasions. We had play clothing, right? And then we had school clothing. And you did not mix them up because we only had so much. When I was growing up, we didn't have a lot, and you took care of it. But my mom loved putting me in the Sunday dresses. I hated it. She would always put leotards on me. Do you remember leotards? But I was so skinny that she would pull them up. They would come halfway up my chest, like almost a full bodysuit. And then she would drop the dress on me. And before the dress was even on me, the leotards would have already been slipping down, giving me like elephant ankles. Now, that didn't bother me that much because in church, there was a woman that played the organ, Mrs. Silo, that I loved. And she always sat at the organ and had her dresses on. And I would sit in the front church pew, and my parents saw this because I was really just, examining my faith. But reason I wanted to sit in the front pew was because she didn't wear full pantyhose. She wore pantyhose socks that went up to her knees. And I would sit there every Sunday morning and make a bet with myself as to how soon they'd fall down. If it was the old rugged cross on a hill far away, they would slowly come down. And I'd think to myself, I'm thinking fourth time through the chorus, they're going to hit the ankle. Or if it was when we all get to heaven, verse 2, they were down. I loved it. And if I nailed it right on the way out of church, there was a basket and it said for visitors, and it was mints. And I would take one if I had won the bet on the socks around her ankles. So when my leotards would pull around my ankles, I thought, man, I'm just like her. And she was pretty cool. Her feet moved across the organ pedals like Dorothy Hamill on ice. So my mom would pull that leotard up, make sure my hair looked pretty, drop a dress on me, and she'd go, "Oh, Kimmy, look at you, such a little lady." And I'd say, I did not like it. When we went to church, the adults stayed in the upstairs part of church for the grown-up church, and the kids went downstairs for what was Sunday school. I loved Sunday school. I had a teacher in Sunday school that was 240 years old. One time, I was behind her doing something and accidentally bumped the top of her head, and dust came out. It was fascinating. I loved her because she would give us all scissors. Different scissors for different kids. If you were a well-behaved child, you got pointy long scissors. But if you were a child that tended to be a little excitable, like I was, I got rounded doll scissors. And as she told the Sunday school lesson using felt on her felt board, we would cut out the felt for the next week. Lions and rocks and water and Jesus. It was so exciting. And then when we were done the lesson, she would let us go outside and play. Now, this was my favorite part of church. We would go out into the parking lot and go over to the green space at the Little Mennonite, Locust Grove Mennonite Church, and we would run around and play. I would climb trees. I would get on my knees and pick little wild buttercups and violets, and we would play boys chase the girls, and we did that until, till my early 20s. And you run fast enough, they can't catch you. Slow enough, they have hope. And I would have the best time ever. And I would walk with my Mary Janes, the only pair I had, a black pair of Mary Janes, nice and shiny, on the roots of the trees. And I would just have so much fun. And then we would go in, and she would come out, and she'd ring a huge bell, this giant bell, and that meant it was time to go in for snack. And we would sit at the table, and, we believed in being grateful for little at that church. And so we would get an animal cracker and a Dixie cup of room temperature water, and we were grateful for it. And then there's a certain way to eat an animal cracker. I mean, it's very serious stuff. First is the head, because you don't want it to see what's coming. I mean, that's just wrong. The next part is the tail, because it's really weird when that tail's twitching and the head is gone, right? And then you eat the body, and we'd run them around the table, and we'd make them last as long as we could, that one animal cracker. And then we'd down that wax-tasting water, and we thought this is the best thing ever. Then it was time to line up at the door so your parent could pick you up. And I would always want to be the first one at the door because I wanted to see my mom and tell her about everything that I did. And I would wait, and I could see my mom coming down the steps, and I would just be full of energy to tell her. And she would turn, and she would look at me standing in the doorway, and she would go, "Oh," and she'd walk over, and she'd pull me out from the doorway into a little corner, and she'd say, "Kimmy, how is it possible that in a little less than an hour you've done this to yourself?" And I'd think, "Done what?" And she would begin. First, she'd wet her thumb, and she'd run it over my Mary Janes, trying to get all the scuffs off. She'd hike my leotards up in front of everybody filing out of class to try and get them to come back up, because from all the running, the foot would have turned and the dirty heel mark was now on the top, right? She would try and fix my hair because the ribbon would be out and wrapped around my wrist because I was Wonder Woman. And in Amish Mennonite country, you have to be able to deflect bullets, right? And she would try and fix my hair, and she'd take some dirt off of my cheek. My bow would be undone, the ends chewed because they only gave us one animal cracker. And she would tie it and say, "Kimmy, just one time a week, can't you just stay clean and neat?" She said, "Why can't you be more of a little lady?" And the timing was always perfect. Right at that moment, out of the other Sunday school classroom would come Aunt Margaret. Aunt Margaret and I were only inches apart in age, but our birthdays fell on either side of the line. So I was in with the younger kids, even though I was so close to her age, and she got to be with the older kids. Number one reason in this story why none of us in this room like her. Okay? And then she would come walking by. Now let me explain Aunt Margaret. Aunt Margaret had a house across the field from us, and it was fenced in. And I would be in the yard hanging upside down, letting the dog lick my face, playing with my brothers, digging in the dirt. And I would sometimes look into her yard and she would be sitting on the swing in a little dress and a little white sweater with her perfectly curled brown hair, holding a baby doll on her shoulder and patting it. Not even swinging. And I'd think, she is so gross. I would be riding my bike up and down the street, and there Aunt Margaret would be in the backyard just sitting on the swing with her little baby doll. Perfect, clean, curled. And she didn't just have one pair of Mary Janes for Sunday. She had a red pair, a white pair, and a black pair, and she wore them all week long. I came from a family where I didn't receive anything that wasn't handed down. And because I was so skinny, the odd thing happened is that I tended to be tall. But to have the hand-me-downs fit me, I would get them from my cousin Susie, who was a little shorter than me, but as thin as I was, a little younger than me. And so all my pants were high waters. Do you remember that term? High waters? It means your pants are too short. So I'd run around in my red Keds and my high water pants, having the time of my life, watching her thinking, what a boring, boring kid. I didn't like her. But here's another reason why we should not like her. She would come out of that Sunday school classroom right when my mom would be fixing me up and telling me that I needed to be a little lady. And she would walk by with her little white sweaters, her dresses with the eyelet, no dirt on her leotards or shoes, her hair perfect. I don't even think she ever lost a tooth. The baby doll on her shoulder, and she'd walk by my mother and she'd go, "Hello, Mrs. Givler." And my mom would go, "Oh, Aunt Margaret, you look lovely." "Thank you, ma'am." You know, are you with me on this one? So I want to sing a little song because Taylor Swift was not the first person to write songs about people that upset her. So I wrote her a little song, and I'm going to teach you one line that you need to say. I want you to say, "Fall down." Oh, come on, my. I know you weren't drinking before the show. I know where I am. You're allowed to make noise. This is a live studio audience. So ready? Say it with me. Say, "Fall down." Fall down. Oh, yes. That feels so good. And skin her knee. Skin her knee. You're terrible. You're going to know when it comes. She had a perfect smile, long brown curls, always looking better than the other girls. Wish she was more like me. Fall down and skin her knee. That was Aunt Margaret. Then there was me. That was Aunt Margaret. Then there was me. Well, I had one and she had two names. I wore Keds and she wore Mary Janes. She had little dresses with white sweaters, and I wore high waters. All my pants, they were high waters. Well, I had freckles on my nose and my cheeks and my toes. Mom said it made me a cutie. But I heard her tell Mrs. Rose I looked a lot like Howdy Doody. Oh, I look like Howdy Doody. If you're young, Google it. Oh, I look like Howdy Doody. Here we go. She had a perfect smile, long brown curls, always looking better than the other girls. Wish she was more like me. Fall down and skin her knee. Therapy, here on the Appleseed. That was Aunt Margaret and me. That was Aunt Margaret. Then there was me. I had two big teeth in the front of my mouth. All the kids called me Bucky. But my daddy said they helped me to chew. and I should consider myself lucky. All the kids, they called me Bucky. But she had a perfect smile, long brown curls, always looking better than the other girls. Wish she was more like me.
Fall down and skin her knee.
That was Aunt Margaret and me. That was Aunt Margaret. Then there was me. Well, one day, it was a Saturday, my mom, it was on a Friday, my mom said, Kimmy, come into the bathroom, I want to put your hair up. And I said, Mom, why are you putting my hair up on a Friday? Church is Sunday. Why are you doing it on a Friday? And she goes, Kimmy, tomorrow's a special day. It's your birthday, and I have a surprise for you. Well, I was so excited that I was like, absolutely. I went in, she put it around her finger, pinned it, put it around her finger, pinned it. And then I went to bed. I could barely sleep. There was a surprise. I got up and I said, should I take out the pin curls, Mom? She said, no, leave them in. She said, the surprise isn't until a little later. She said, get dressed and come down for breakfast. Yes, ma'am. I went down and had a complete nutritious breakfast. I had a nice glass of Tang and some Captain Crunch that ripped apart the top of my mouth, and it was delightful. And then I said, Mom, now can I take it on? She goes, no, I told you it's later. And I'm like, okay. And she said, Chris, my dear brother Chris, who really is the one that got me into understanding storytelling at its best while walking in the woods and so forth. She said, Chris, I want you to take your sister on a walk. She said about an hour and a half would be perfect. And off we went. Now, when my brother Chris and I would take walks, we would go into the woods and he would make up magical fairy tales that he had written in his own mind, and then we'd come back and get coloring pencils out and draw pictures of what he had made. So as we walked, he started to tell me stories and spin stories, and we picked up sticks, and we were kings and queens and fighting battles, and we would run, and we had a fort out there, and we made little corn husk dolls, and then we went down to the creek, and we rolled up our pants and kicked off our shoes, and we walked through the creek, and water snakes were going by, and skippers on the top of the water, and then he said, do you want to make a clover crown? I'm like, I love making clover crowns, best brother ever. And we would make crowns of clover, and he'd put it on me, and then we'd always work on one, and every day almost during the spring and summer, and add it to a long one, because for sure we were going to make it into the Guinness World Book of Records at some point. It didn't happen. And we just had a great time, and we were walking past my Grandma Anna's little farmette and headed up the hill, and we saw my mom coming out of the house. And she met us at the end of the yard. And the thing is, when she came out of the house, she wasn't walking. She was kind of hovering and flying towards us. And that is the sign that you have done something wrong. When your mother flies and hovers as she speeds towards you, you know you've done something wrong. And I stopped at the edge of the yard because it was still a safe space because neighbors could see. And I said, Mom, what's wrong? And she goes, Christopher, I told you an hour and a half, and it has been almost 2.5 hours. Where were you? And he's like, Mom, we just walked the normal walk we normally take. Back then, children, we didn't have phones and things, so there was no way to tell. And she looked at me and she said, Kimmy, what have you been doing? My knees were covered with grass stains. My pants were soaked on the bottom. Even my sneakers were squishing. There are still probably bobby pins in the woods where we played. I was filthy and dirty. My face was a mess. I was happy. And she said, you needed to be back over an hour ago. I needed you here so you could clean up and get a bath and fix your hair and put on the new dress that I bought you. And I said, Mom, what is the big deal? I said, I wasn't rude, trust me. But I said, Mom, what is the big deal? Every birthday, it's just my brothers and my sister. And she goes, I have a surprise for you this year. She said, I invited a friend to enjoy your birthday with you. And right at that moment, I heard the side door of the house open, and out stepped Aunt Margaret. I looked at my mom and I said, Mom, why is the enemy at my house? And she said, whose house? And I said, you know what I mean, Mom, why? And she said, Kimmy, she never has anyone to play with. You just usually play by yourself and you have your brothers and sisters. So I invited her up to enjoy your birthday party with you. She said, you march inside, go in, get your hair down and brush it. Just wash your face and hands with a wash rag. The dress is on the bed. Yes, ma'am. As I walked to the house, Aunt Margaret was standing there with a baby draped over her shoulder. She had on a yellow and white gingham dress with a crinoline underneath. What a show-off. She had on lacy white tights, white Mary Janes, and she had a little white sweater on that had yellow rickrack around the sleeves. And in her hair was a silk yellow bow that looked like a UFO had landed on her head. As I walked by her, she looked me up and down, while patting her baby and said, hello. And I looked at her and I said, hello. And I went inside and I went into my room and I went into the bathroom and I began to cry. How could my mom do this to me? This is my birthday. She knows that I don't like her. She's asked me to play with her before, and I'm like, she really doesn't want to. Why would she invite her to my birthday party? I pulled the bobby pins out of my hair. My hair was tangled. It looked like I had a lion's mane on my head. I washed my hands and face the best that I could, went in, took off my Snoopy t-shirt, my polyester bell bottoms, because we knew style in the 70s. And then I put on the dress she bought me. Let me just expand on that. It was a red and white checkered long dress. Long, to the floor. So I have to wear short pants, but a long dress. Figure that out. And a white eyelet with black velvet. And I'm telling you, I look like the Cocoa Swiss Miss girl on the package of the hot chocolate. And I thought, this is just the worst birthday I've ever had in my life. I went out and sat down at the dining room table. They sang happy birthday. I blew out and spit on the cake. Don't you think it's funny that cake's the only thing you can light on fire, spit on, and people are like, yeah, I'll take a piece, right? Try doing that with Sunday pot roast, right? No one's going to eat it, but birthday cake, sure, And my brothers took their cake and left. They could tell this was not going to be a good situation. Plus, they didn't want to hang out with two girls, especially one that was really unhappy about the dress. And my sister was just too little. She was napping. And so my mom looked at us and said, I am so glad to see the two of you together. She said, I really want you to enjoy each other. And she left the room. Apparently, she had forgotten that I was a raging redhead. And the minute she was out of earshot, I looked at Aunt Margaret and said, I didn't ask her to have you come here. I don't want you here. And she looked at me and said, pat that baby. Pat that plastic baby. Well, that didn't get to her. So I said, you know what? I don't even want that gift. It was pink paper and a pink tag and purple gel pen, my name written on it. Everything I hated. And I looked at it and I said, I don't want it. I don't care if there's $1 million in it. And I took my finger and pushed it off the edge of the table. I know, right? What happens when no adults are... What kind of parents did I have? She paused her hand above the baby for just a minute, a second. And then she continued to pat. Put her nose up and looked away. And I took a good look at her. Pristine white sweater. Pristine dress. Perfect curls. Even me, sitting there, dressed up, I could still see dirt underneath my fingernails and some dirt on the back of my hand. And I looked at her and I thought, man, she's never been dirty a day in her life. She is missing out. And I said, hey, Aunt Margaret. And she looked over at me. And in front of me was a piece of my mother's famous black magic cake with peanut butter frosting, my favorite. I slid my hand under the cake between the bottom of that moist chocolate cake and plate. And I lifted it and I held it in my hand. And I said, you know what? Her hand was frozen above that baby doll. Her mouth was starting to open. And I said, you don't know what it's like to be dirty. It's fabulous. Watch this. And I leaned back with that piece of cake and shoved it in my mouth. You thought I was going to shove it on her, didn't you? So who's the evil one in the room? Shoved it in my mouth, peanut butter frosting. I chewed it right in front of her, wiped my hands down that new dress, and I said, it's delicious. She looked at me in shock right as my mother walked in. My mom looked at us, the gift on the floor, Aunt Margaret, hand paused above her plastic baby, mouth wide open, me covered in her rich, dark cake and icing. And she said, "What are you doing?" They actually get a weird voice. It's almost like, "What are you doing?" It was just really scary. And she's like, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Mom, you don't understand." And she goes, "I do understand." She said, "You were not raised like this." And I said, "Well, no one else is raising me, so I don't understand." And she goes, "Don't you talk to me like that." And I said, "Well, Mom, the cake was really moist." And she goes, "I don't want to hear it." She said, "You go to your room right now. March." I stood up and I went to the room and I went to the bathroom and I stood in front of the mirror and I started to tear up again. I tried to get the icing off of my face. "Happy birthday, Kimmy" was written in a blue frosting that, let me just tell you, it spreads in your hair as you try and remove it. I went in and slipped my dress off and threw it into the tub. It was going to need some major work, and put on my clothing. And I went to the door and cracked it. And I heard my mom say, "Aunt Margaret, honey, I'm so sorry. I don't know what got into her." She said, "I think it's best that you go home." Ba, 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 ba. I had won the war. She was going home early. I knew she'd never come back. I was like, yes. And I went skipping out as I heard the door shut. And I said, "Mom, can I have another piece of cake?" And she said, "Sit down." I sat down across from her at the dining room table as she wiped with a wash rag the table. And she said, "Kimmy, I do not know what you were thinking." I said, "Mom, I don't like her. She's snooty. She doesn't want to ever play. She hardly ever talks to me. And she likes baby dolls." I had blue miniature suitcases filled with Matchbox cars, Tonka trucks, remote control cars. Anything that had wheels is what I wanted. I said, "Mom, we just don't have anything in common. I don't like her." And she said, "I don't care." She said, "You know what I think? Maybe you don't know everything." She said, "You're going to go apologize." I said, "When?" She said, "Now." I said, "Yes, ma'am." I left the house and walked really slow down to Aunt Margaret's. I walked up and I knocked on the door and her mama opened the door. And it was then that I realized that her mother always looked perfect too. She took a look at me and she goes, "Oh, Kimmy, your hair is blue." I said, "I know." She said, "Are you okay?" I said, "Yeah, I'm okay." I said, "Where's Aunt Margaret?" And she said, "She's out back on the swing." I'm like, I figured. I said, "Okay." I said, "I'm here to apologize to her for my behavior at my birthday party." She said, "Okay." So I went around the side of the house and opened the gate and I went in. I kind of kept my head down. I saw where she was sitting on the swing, and as I walked, I stopped until I saw her feet dangling. And I said, "I'm here to apologize for my behavior at my birthday party." Nothing. I looked up and she was white-knuckling the chains. I saw she had tears down her face. Her baby doll was hanging precariously off of her lap. And I said, "Aunt Margaret, I came to apologize for my behavior at my birthday party. I'm sorry." Nothing. And I looked at her and I said, "Fine. My mom told me to do this, and I did it, so I'm going home." And as I turned around to leave, she used words that we were not allowed to use in our house. She said, "I hate you." I turned around and looked at her and I said, "You hate me?" I said, "You hate me?" She said, "Yes, I hate you." She said, "I hate you." She said, "I'm down here all the time by myself and you always are playing with brothers and sisters and I don't have any brothers or sisters." And she said, "And you have a dog and I want a dog so bad and my mama won't let me have a dog." And she said, "And you have a dad. I see him come home every day and I don't have a dad. And my mom makes me dress like this, and I hate it because I can't do anything because she doesn't want me to get dirty. I hate you." I stood there and just let that settle in on me. I had just turned 12. And in that moment, I felt more adult than probably any other time in my life. And then I began to laugh. And I began to laugh, and she said, "Get out of my yard. You are not allowed in my yard ever again." I said, "No, you don't understand, because I hate you too." And she said, "Why?" I said, "Oh, you're perfect. My mom thinks you're perfect. She loves your hair. She loves your bows. She loves your dresses. You never get dirty." And that was that. I left. And the next day I went down and knocked on the door, and her mama answered. And I said, "Hi, I'm here to see if Aunt Margaret can come out and play." And she goes, I said, "I promise I'll bring her back clean." And she said, "Let me see if she wants to come along." And I said, "Okay." And she did. Man, oh man, did I teach her the ropes. I taught her which berries she could eat that would only make her throw up a little bit. We went out into the woods and we played at the fort, and I was the queen, and I told her that she was the peasant because my game. I taught her how to make corn husk dolls. I taught her how to drive my remote control car. I taught her how to rubber band her plastic baby doll to the remote control car and watch it hurtle down the road. I taught her how to go down to the creek, slip off her shoes, lay her little leotards beside them gently, and to hold her dress and to run like a wild animal through that creek. And then we dry off sitting on the porch of my great-grandma Detter's. And then we get her all suited back up, and I take her home and deliver her. My first album is Freckles, Fibs, and Family. So long ago. And on the back it says, "If your name is Aunt Margaret and you ever lived on Farm Drive, please email me." We became best friends for several years. And then her mom met somebody, got married. And I can remember standing at the end of the driveway waving at her as she left. The only thing we had back then were letters and maybe a phone call. We didn't have all the social media of today, and over time, we went our separate ways. But our few years together as the very best of friends was almost bittersweet, because even as a child, and even till now, I recognized that if I would have heard her story, which she told me, unedited, unprepared, in an authentic moment in seconds, it shifted the whole foundation of what we saw in each other. And it has stayed with me to understand not to judge those that irritate me. We don't know what they're swallowing on a daily basis. That is my friend Aunt Margaret.
Thanks for joining us for A Story from the Appleseed.